Good morning subscribers, G-Economics here. Today, this is my first video actually for a number of weeks, certainly with regard to economic theory. And this is specifically for my Year 12 economists who have been looking at the relationship between demand, price, quantity, but we've been looking at the extension material in the textbook, some of you may be familiar with that, and we have been looking at the income effect and the substitution effect. And so it's those two concepts which I want to tackle in this particular video. The income and the substitution effects of a price change. Now of course you will all be familiar, those of you having completed GCSE economics you'll be familiar with this as well. You'll be familiar obviously with the downward sloping demand curve, whereby if there is an increase in price, we get a reduction in quantity demanded, and if there is a reduction in price, you get an increase in quantity demanded. And for most goods, the majority of goods, that is the relationship that exists between quantity demanded and price. It's, as you know, it's referred to as an inverse relationship. So we're going from P1, Q1, if you reduce the price down to P2, then we get an expansion of demand. Remember that phrase, ladies and gentlemen? Remember we call that an expansion of demand, an increase in demand. And also remember, nota bene, that a change in price is one of the only things which causes a change in quantity demanded. And similarly, if we go the other way, price rises, we move in this direction along the quantity, and so we get a contraction of demand, this movement along. And so that's what I'm explaining here. Now let's think then of your inferior good. So this is something which is obviously not a normal good, so an inferior good. And the example that I was using with my class was the example of a VHS video recorder, which some of you may know. Interestingly, this morning on the news in the Financial Times, they were talking about records and vinyl. And now vinyl for quite some time used to be considered an inferior good for about the last 20 years, but now the popularity is rocketing again, and vinyl, a Czech Republic firm, is expanding massively in the production of vinyl, so it just shows how these things can come and go. But anyway, it's probably unlikely that VHS videotape is going to make a massive resurgence. So that's an inferior good, VHS video players. If you become more wealthy, and in other words, if your income rises, then you're more likely to switch away from the VHS video recorder and buy a more up-to-date alternative, such as a DVD player, or you might stream films and so on. So that's how things move on, so that's why it's inferior. It's also worth noting, which shout out to Philip here in my Year 12 class, because he was talking yesterday about the fact that actually during a recession, he said, is it the case that the demand for inferior goods goes up? I said, yes, Philip, absolutely. It is the case. Because, of course, as people find that their incomes drop, they switch from buying the more expensive goods. They switch maybe from Heinz to buying Tesco's Own or Sainsbury's Basics or whatever it may be. And so the demand alters depending upon where we are also in the economic cycle. So that's a good point to reference there. So in the case of an inferior good, if the price rises of the inferior good, the demand will go up. And if the price falls, the demand will also fall. Now I've just written here to the left of this is best understood by considering the real income effect. So when you're thinking about inferior goods, it's always best to think about, well, what's happening to income rather than simply what's happening to the price. Now, that's why I always like to think of it. So let's think about that then. Let's think about what we mean by the real income effect. So let me just check that we're in shot here, ladies and gents. Okay. So the real income effect, ladies and gentlemen, I like to think of it as the real income or the real wage, defined as the money wage, W, divided by the price level, P. So in other words, it's giving you a flavour of the basket of goods, here, good phrase to use, the basket of goods that you can purchase given your income. So for example, very basic example, if you earn £100 a week and the item which you are buying is £25 per item, so you've got your W and you've got your price, then obviously in that case you can buy 4 items. If, however, there's a change in price, which is of course what we were just considering there, if price falls maybe to £20, then it's 100 over 20, and so obviously you can buy 5. So the basket of goods that you can buy has gone up. So that's a really important thing to think about now when we can come to consider these income effects and these substitution effects. And I think the first thing to mention on these is that the income effect can either be positive or negative. Income effect likely to be positive in the sense that you could potentially buy a larger basket of goods, or negative, smaller basket. And then substitution effect, that can also be positive or negative. In other words, will you start to buy more of this particular good in question because of the change in your real income, or less of the good in question because of the change in your real income? So a normal good, think of t-shirt or anything at all really. If the price of the t-shirt goes up, so we're considering here this equation, if the price of the t-shirt goes up, then on the bottom line we've got an increase. So it's sort of this in reverse, this example I've just given you. Now that means that your purchasing power, the basket of goods that you can purchase, will fall, and therefore I'm saying here that the overall purchasing power of your real income or your real wage will fall. So consequently that is obviously a negative income effect. So you'll potentially, more than likely, for a normal good you'll buy less of it. But also think about this in terms of price rising and what you will then do as a consequence. So if, for example, this is the price of a Next t-shirt, sort of fairly standard, middle of the road sort of t-shirt, and the price of it goes up, you will then switch, maybe, theoretically anyway, you would switch to buying a good from, say, Primani's, or that's a well-known Irish company, Duness stores, which would be cheaper, not necessarily less quality, but it would be cheaper. And so for this particular good in question, the Next t-shirt, you buy less of it. So you'll be substituting the Primark t-shirt or the Duness t-shirt for and in place of the Next t-shirt. And so again, the substitution effect here would be reinforcing that negative income effect. So you get 2 negative effects pushing back on the demand for this good. Now you can think of that in the reverse as well, in terms of a price reduction. So if the price falls, what happens to your overall purchasing power and the basket that you can buy? It goes up. It's a positive income effect. Price falls as well, might push your Next t-shirt maybe below the price of a t-shirt from Primark or Duness. And so again you'll substitute, you might have been buying 1 or 2 t-shirts from Primark, now you buy them all from Next. And so you get a positive substitution effect. And so both of those forces are pushing demand up, ladies and gents. Now let's think about the inferior good, which is the more difficult one to think about really. And again, we're looking at, in the first instance, an increase in price. Now we said over here an increase in price leads to an increase in demand, so we need to think about why that's the case. Because your income, your real purchasing power, falls in the same way that it does up here. It's the same scenario. The real income effect is actually negative. So in terms of the income effect, if the price goes up, then strictly speaking you probably buy less of it. But this isn't a strictly speaking case. This is a special case. This is an inferior good case. And so because it's an inferior good, in other words, maybe not quite as good quality, but you're facing a drastic cut in your income, actually you'll start to buy lots more of this relatively inferior good. So think during the recession what happens. People lose jobs, lose income, lose family incomes and so on, and as a consequence they actually buy more into the inferior goods. And indeed, ladies and gentlemen, if you want to read more about this, consult the Sunday Times from Sunday just past, 28th of October, I think. 29th maybe. And the article there talking all about the continued expansion and growth of things like pound stretcher, pound land, B&M bargains. All of these, what we would, I guess, refer to as relatively inferior goods, well, people are buying into them big time because the recession is still biting. And of course, if the interest rate goes up tomorrow, then maybe that will continue to be the case, so growth industry. But the more important one here, ladies and gentlemen, is to think about the substitution effect. So we've said the income effect is negative. Price rises, real income falls, potentially you buy less. But because your income has fallen, you then think to yourself, right, I've got to cut my cloth to my income here. And so as a consequence of my cut in my income, I'm going to abandon those other more expensive goods, and actually I'm going to substitute this cheaper, inferior good in their place. And so I'll buy more of this inferior good. And so what you find is you get a very positive substitution effect. So the income effect is working this way, pushing down demand for this good. So VHS video recorders, maybe. Whereas the substitution effect, because it's times of austerity and recession, is pushing demand up. And so actually what you'll find is this very positive substitution effect might very well outweigh the negative income effect, and so you see an increase in the demand for the inferior good. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the way this works. And very quickly I'll just explain the reverse of that. So we've said here that a fall in price leads to a fall in demand. Well, think about what happens again here in terms of your real wage. So that's fallen. So obviously your real wage has gone up. So you've got a very positive income effect there. However, now, because you're relatively more wealthy, you will substitute more expensive goods in the place of this inferior one. So you'll go out and you'll buy DVD players instead of the VHS player. And so in this case, this positive income effect is outweighed by the very negative substitution effect. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the explanation of this income and substitution effects for normal goods and inferior goods. So, bye for now. I've really enjoyed seeing quite a few questions from you lately online, so it's been really good, really interesting. Keep those coming, and any requests for videos as well, just do send me a message. I intend to go on in the next few weeks just to do some on market failure and then positive and negative externality diagrams, because that was quite difficult, I think, for my group. So, bye for now.